that's where I was getting to that point. It's like, I think so often worship can be hijacked by feeling, and if I don't have a feeling, or there isn't an aha, then I really haven't.
That's so good, yeah.
And I'm not sure, and I guess that's how that's where the worship part comes for me. It's like,
oh, I had a happy feeling. I did a worship.
Yes, when you brought up that, it's such a cute thing.
Yeah. It's emotional.
And it's not always.
Yeah.
Welcome to How I See It with me, Mark Pratt, and
Justin Sternberg. This is a podcast that works to counter cultural polarization through thoughtful conversations.
How are you, sir?
Now you can ask about mine.
Oh, I'm asking about your dad joke?
I'm well. How are you?
I am also well. Yes, indeed.
I am a little groggy.
Yeah?
And you're groggy? Is that right?
Yeah.
All right.
But that's
we're
all right.
We're not going to let you know that we're groggy.
Yeah.
You're not going to be able to tell.
This might be a two. You might need to listen to this at 2 times versus a time and a half just to make it move along there as we...
Well, I suggest you do that every time.
That's true.
It takes an hour episode, makes it 30. I mean,
exactly.
It's hard to beat
you
that.
Click right through that.
And we sound smarter, so I'm all for it.
I could always use a little sound smarter.
Yeah.
But
same.
Yeah.
Same.
No.
So what are we talking about today?
Well, it's been an interesting process. I've been thinking a lot about worship. Just what does it mean? And it was interesting. Happened to bring up your recording that you did a while back for the church for that depression, and I was just I was taken back by how.
So,
go ahead.
To pause you.
Yes, to pause me.
There might be a few people listening who know what you're talking about,
but there's a few that don't.
Yeah.
Yes, that's why you had made a recording for the church regarding mental health. There was some mental health segments that were entitled "Let's Talk About It," and your segment had more to do with depression. Mm-hmm. And we've talked about depression. This isn't necessarily. We'll have a foreshadowing. We're gonna have a segment on depression and that kind of thing.
It's going to be really full of levity. So.
There you go. But in that video, we happened to be watching it because we happened to be away during that time. And you were talking about how songs, can actually bring you out of that. And, and I've just kind of been in a stage myself, a learning area where I've been reflecting on worship. What does it mean? And I think, it can be one of those words we throw out there as far as that goes. And as I was thinking about that, I was thinking about how even you and Megan, together, tend to be worship leaders. And, and I just recognize how important that is in your life. And I was just thinking about that as a topic, getting your thoughts and kind of sharing, what does it mean when, we think about worship where you're concerned?
Well, we can make this real short, Mark.
Okay.
I just Googled define worship, and we have a dictionary definition. It says the feeling or expression of reverence and adoration for a deity. Example, the worship of God. Or verb, show reverence and adoration for a deity, honor with religious rites. There you go.
Yeah.
Does that do it?
Well, not as far as I'm concerned. Because I think at times we can worship things unknowingly. I think it's not always just deities.
Yeah.
Although, are they? I guess would be my question. Can I make something? Can I make an animate object a deity?
You deify.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I guess that's the thing, you know, and I that's where I'm at with how I see it. Are there things in our culture that we have deified? Is technology deified? Is what is Instagram and Facebook and what other people think about me deified from a people pleasing perspective, you know? And I guess that's where I've been personally wrestling with what does it mean to worship? And I don't want to make it some big nebulous type thing, but I that's been the struggle. And as I was, you know, thinking about your video and how songs and, you know, and what we say, the words we use tend to reflect a sense of worship. And I think, you know, we can at times worship things that are not capital D deity type dynamics, God, you know, and I realize even that can have a different connotation depending on, you know, my religious background, that kind of thing. Who is God? What is God? You know, and I guess that's where the worship part came to for me. And I was actually kind of coming to you with that recognition as someone who tends to lead worship. What does it mean? You know, how do you go through that process? What is that process like for you? Even in a daily basis, not just in a communal.
Yeah. I was going to say, you started the conversation in terms of breaking down what worship is and which way you're pointing, right? Like what the object of your worship is, and I would like to kind of break down the other direction, which is what's considered worship.
Yeah.
And I think traditionally, and when you hear the word worship, you think what that definition talks about. But in like a church setting, you know, maybe heads bowed, maybe whatever, it kind of this respectful reverence experiential thing, right?
Sure.
You experience a worship.
Yep. And I would say
I just did a worship.
Yeah, and even I think even saying the word worship is automatically going to exclude certain people who think, well, I don't like to sing songs. I don't like to do that worship thing.
Right.
So therefore, you know, and I think that's where it's coming back to for me is what does it look like on a daily basis? What is it, or do I, you know? And that's where I'm coming back to you with that, is that.
Yeah, that's kind of where I was getting to, right? It's this idea that, quote unquote, being someone who leads in worship or whatever, that act of being up on a stage or on a floor or whatever it is, with a microphone or not, whatever that looks like, is not the full picture of what worship is. And I mean, I would argue if that's all someone is doing in their life for worship is getting up on that stage and quote unquote leading you, then I'm not necessarily confident that their leading is working, right? Like,
let me understand that.
What I mean is worship is every day. You said this earlier before we started recording. We were made to worship. Like, there's something in our brains, right, that's desiring to worship, and
much like relationship, even it's almost like we're pre-wired to have relationship with people, and we would probably see worship as one of those pre-wired dynamics.
Yeah, we would certainly see it that way, especially, I mean, because of our theological positions, right?
Sure.
Which is believing that we are created for that. We were created for that purpose. But yeah, so essentially, that means that throughout my day, my week, or whatever, I should be being pulled towards worship. And right now, you might be able to hear the birds coming through the window, and I love that sound.
Sure.
For me, that's worship. It's recognition. So I guess what I was gonna say too is anything can be worship. Any act can become an act of worship. And any act or anything can become a deterrence to worship. Does that make sense? So we're really breaking it down now. But, you're talking about kind of standing in a worship experience at church or whatever. I'm saying, no, I think listening to the birds come in can be an act of worship where it reminds you. It serves as the lyric of a song to say, my Father is good. And He's created this world. And He feeds the birds of the air. And listen to them, how happy they are. They aren't worried. And He says, I'm supposed to not worry like they're not worried. Listen to those guys. They're not, I need to be like them, right? Like, that can happen in that second.
Sure.
That one
celebration of a new day. The sun's rising again.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, or hard work is another good example where it can serve as an opportunity to remember that God created us to do good work, good hard work, and that Ecclesiastes, he talks about, I did all the partying, I did all the fun stuff, and you know what really makes me feel like I belong here? It's a good hard day's work, and then enjoying my friends in a meal at the end of the day.
Sure.
Right? It's this idea that work is something we are designed to do, and it can become an experience of worship where you recognize this is what I was created to do.
Sure.
And I could go on and on and on, right? Like hardships. Recognizing that, like, well, crap, the school just called, my child is not feeling well, like they're going to throw up. And that just really throws a wrench in my day because I was working on this thing. Now I got to leave. I got to do all this stuff. And even worse, maybe my kid isn't okay, right?
Sure, yeah.
But often that's not my first thought. It's like, oh, okay, how do I solve this? And whatever. It's sad. But Megan is the opposite. She thinks about this is why we're a good team, right? She's like, the children. I'm like, my job.
Yes.
This is why we're a good team. I'm like, oh, yes, you're right, the children. Because I'm always assuming they're good, It's like,
sure.
They're probably, the point is, when those hardships come up, those are opportunities as well to turn them over and worship. To be able to say, there's something in this, that you're in this.
Yeah.
You're in this, and there's something about this that I can see you in it. And maybe it's not today, but I can, hope is faith is the substance of things hoped for.
Sure.
So it's this idea that I don't know what this thing necessarily means today, but I have faith, which is my hope that it will mean something.
Sure.
That there's a purpose in it.
Sure.
That it will, and so I can treat those moments where, well, I guess I'm supposed to be spending that time this afternoon with my daughter or my son.
Sure.
So I'm going to, as soon as they get in the car, be the best darn dad I can be really caring, not be thinking about work, but recognize, no, God called me out of work for a reason. I'm gonna do this as an act of worship. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I'd be curious how at times you challenge yourself or pull yourself into that. You follow me? How has that become?
Well, I'll be the first to say I don't always. I mean, that's certainly not what I'm saying. I'm saying there are opportunities
all throughout the day, and I think that's where I'm asking in this process of life. How have you brought that into your who you are? How has that become a greater part of your character, if you will, to be mindful that opportunity, not only that opportunity, but the next opportunity can be an opportunity for worship? Because I'm hearing this process that it's a transition for you, or it's been a growth or a learning that you've acquired over time because it wasn't necessarily natural for you. Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
And and walk me through how that has become important to you, or what has made that important to you.
Well, the answer is not a good one in terms of sound bites.
Okay.
Like, it's not a listicle. It's not.
Yeah.
I mean, unfortunately, it's a lifetime of work, right? And I think, or fortunately, really, I mean, that's how it's supposed to work. It's not. But I mean, in terms of like, I wish I could give you this. Oh, here's the top 5 things, and you'll be whatever.
We're not a top 5 things. This is a how I see it podcast.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. So how I see it, Mark. How I see it.
Yeah.
The first thing that came to mind when you started talking about that is accountability. Is this, and I don't just mean showing up and someone saying, "Hey, are you doing your stuff this week?" or whatever. I mean, I go to places where they are displaying worship through gratitude or through whatever, and I go, yeah, this is a breath of fresh air hearing that. I need to do that.
Yeah.
And then repeat for 10 years, right?
Sure.
And you're more likely going to be like that as a result of that input.
Sure.
You know?
Yeah,
garbage in, garbage out.
Yeah.
Good stuff in, good stuff out, right? Like,
Yeah.
and I think for me, that's a big part of it, is being in atmospheres where hardships are looked at through an attitude of worship. And I'm specifically referring to Celebrate Recovery, where we are dealing with hurts, habits, and hangups.
Sure.
You know, on an ongoing and regular basis. And the way through it is worship. You know?
Sure.
And that's like a generic term for what we do, but I think it's accurate to say I can dwell on my situation, or I can worship God through it. I can look at him, use him as the lens through which I look at these hurts, habits, and hangups, and start to move forward with that view.
Sure.
And that's what is successful.
Yeah.
And the other thing I would say is reading God's word.
I hear you.
Because like I said, the sparrows of the air, he feeds them. They don't worry. All that stuff is right from the Bible. And if you spend time in his word for, again, read enough each morning that you go, okay, I got a nugget. I'm going to carry this nugget with me the rest of the day.
Yeah.
That can take you literally 2 minutes. If you stumble on the right verse, you're like, man, that's good.
Sure.
Put it in your pocket and go to work.
Yeah.
And do that for 10 years.
Sure.
Right? And 10 years later, you're going to have lots of stuff. Your pockets are going to be overflowing. And it'll come out in
those
worship.
Those
nuggets, yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
You just used a word here just a bit ago, gratitude. Help me understand, how do you see those two as synonymous? Are they different in some ways? I'm just thinking about worship, gratitude. I'm not trying, because I think gratitude can be its own topic. Don't get me wrong.
Yeah, I think they can become synonymous, but I actually think gratitude is the catalyst, right? It's the thing that converts this experience into that experience. You know, like in science, the catalyst is the thing that you add to this thing, and it becomes a completely other thing, right? As a result of that catalyst being introduced, now you have, you know what I mean?
Sure.
And
it helps a process. It speeds it up. It changes it. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, the idea behind, from what I vaguely remember from high school science, is it takes a thing that was this thing and now it's this thing.
Sure.
Because this catalyst was introduced. In other words, it's not speeding up a thing. It's completely converting a thing from this direction to this direction. Like, completely new thing as a result of a catalyst. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah.
And so I think that is what gratitude is. It can take this thing and fill in the blank. All the things we just talked about. You add gratitude, and now, boom, worship. You got to worship. I did a worship. Right? Like, I think it can easily divert what's going on into worship.
Sure.
So I do think they do go hand in hand. They're not the same thing necessarily, I think. But I think gratitude is that catalyst that says,
it's a part of the process.
Yeah.
Yeah. To where it's in some ways maybe fundamental or foundational to
Yeah.
the process of worship.
I guess I can't fathom how you could do worship without gratitude. Like,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah,
So
that's what I'm
I think
saying.
you're
It's-
absolutely right. I think it is a required catalyst, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So maybe we got this in the wrong order. We should have started with gratitude, but yeah. And I'm thinking about that from that aspect of the end result. You follow me? Because we can, when now we have, you just said, now we have a worship.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? And I think,
Look at it. So cute.
yes, I have this feeling, I have this, this nugget that you shared, and I'm thinking about that in that process. Because,
Okay, can I pause real quick?
yes, of course.
I don't think a feeling is necessarily. Oh, did I beat you to the point?
No, that's exactly.
Yeah,
That's exactly.
A feeling is not necessarily worship. I think worship is a direction that you're paying attention.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
there may be a feeling that goes along with our
bonus.
act of worship, a bonus, icing on the cake, if you will. Yeah. But and that's where I was getting to that point. It's like, I think so often worship can be hijacked by feeling, and if I don't have a feeling or there isn't an aha, then I really haven't.
That's so good. Yeah.
And I'm not sure, and I guess that's how that's where the worship part comes for me. It's like,
oh, I had a happy feeling. I did a worship.
Yes, when you brought up that, it's such a cute thing.
Yeah. It's emotional.
And it's not always.
Yeah.
And I think about the hard times. I even think about, Chris and her family just going through, her dad's, death, that kind of thing. And, just the worship of God going before that entire process, that it's in the hard things, I think, sometimes, that we don't necessarily see or experience the feeling, but yet there's something greater than just an emotional high, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
There's a peace, there's a sense that's even deeper, or there's an assurance, the hope that you that you referred to, even in the midst of a difficult circumstance, and I can still choose to worship and say, okay, yeah, there is a purpose in this, and I may not necessarily see all of it, but yet I can choose to praise, if you will. And I recognize, that there is a good God who is operating on my behalf, regardless of the circumstance.
You mentioned another, I think, key word, right? So we're talking about key components to worship.
Yeah.
You said choose. And I do believe that is, so I think when we started the conversation with it, sometimes we passively allow other things to come in between worship, right? And you use the idea that, okay, now we're worshiping that thing because it's come between, and I think that's probably accurate, except I think that choice in worship is so crucial.
Sure.
This idea that I know what I'm doing.
Yeah.
And it's that direction of where you're paying attention, like I said, but I'm doing it on, I'm aware of it. And I think, to your point about emotions, sometimes they can make you lose track of the choice. And it can, like you said, become simply an emotional experience that feels worshipful. But I do think, how I see it, that worship, there's a key component of choice there, of choosing it, is purposefulness in it. And I think the hard times make that purposefulness, that choice, that much more poignant, right?
Yeah.
It's like, I have to do this, I need to, it's important, and yet it's hard. It's a difficult thing sometimes to choose worship.
Yeah, and
But
I guess from a polarizing topic of sorts, wouldn't you agree that sometimes we worship things by default?
mm,
We never some things we I think we can inadvertently worship without necessarily knowing we are indirectly choosing
mm.
that path.
Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like we did a podcast on true leadership, right?
Yeah,
And
I was there, I think.
yeah, pretty sure you were there. um, but one thing we really harped on in that episode is this idea that yes, there's this idea of what leadership is, but we're talking about true leadership, right?
Yeah.
Basically, and it is a how I see it.
Yeah.
True leadership. I think what I'm talking about, worship being a choice, it's a very much a how I see it, true worship.
I gotcha.
Where I do think we like you're saying, we can replace that with a passive, reactive version of it.
Sure.
That I'm not sure I'd like to call it worship.
Yeah.
I think I'd more prefer to call it a distraction. But we often do, like in the Christian world, theologically talk about that becoming a new way, taking the place of your worshiping. You're worshiping this thing or this event or this person or whatever. And I think it's effective. It's an effective illustration of what's happening.
Gotcha.
But I'm not sure I truly would say that worship is happening if it's not intentional. Is that fair? I don't know if I'm even 100% on this idea, but it's like this.
And that's the part that I want to wrestle with, even in some ways.
Yeah.
Because I believe, if we want to go scriptural from an Old Testament standpoint, I think of Moses when he went up on the mountain, and it wasn't too awful long. He was with God, and he was in God's presence, and he comes back down, and there's the people of Israel worshiping the golden idol, the golden calf.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
But that was intentional. They got to get, like, Aaron asked everyone in the community to give all their gold earrings or whatever. And he said, we are choice, intention. We are going to make a golden calf and we are going to worship it.
Sure.
It wasn't like oops, I accidentally made my motorcycle an idol and now I'm worshiping it because I spend all my time with it.
I see what you're saying.
I think that was worship.
Yes,
of course incorrectly positioned, but
and I think that's where I was at, where you were concerned. True worship, can, I guess, maybe true deity versus true worship can be two separate things. I can truly worship something that isn't necessarily truly deity.
Right. Good. Yeah.
That can be a choice. And from my perspective, I think sometimes we can do that by default when we recognize, okay, if we're acknowledging God, who he is, if he's not performing the way that I want him to in response to my worship, I may choose to worship something else. Yeah. And I guess that's maybe that aspect of true deity versus true worship.
I like that.
And I think that's what.
What's interesting too is I think you can do quote unquote true worship without calling it that, because I think so I'm thinking about what you just said.
Sure.
You basically said, I might be disappointed in this deity, so I choose to send my worship somewhere else. But it's not like, so I think about
I would recognize that as a choice, like you're saying. I would recognize that that is something I'm choosing to do. Yep.
I guess what I was going to say is I am choosing to do it, but I'm not knowing that it's effectively worship. And if I would, it's not like I'm choosing to worship this thing. I'm choosing to take all of my focused attention, intentioned focused attention from this thing to this thing. And this is now, and so now I'm talking about, I have this particular subject in mind, but I'm not going to use it because I feel like we don't want to go that direction and polarize or whatever. But it's like this was the greater good, but now this is the greatest good, and this is the ideal, and everything falls to this ideal, and everything matters here, and this is why. It's because this is so important, and like all that focused, intention focused.
Yeah.
I think is exactly what you're talking about, is replacing a worship of a deity with another thing, another ideal, another focus, another person, another whatever it is, where you say this is what matters.
Yeah.
This is what I am focused on. This is what guides me, directs me.
Yes.
Feeds me,
And I guess what I'm thinking in this process, and the to bring it back to the worship, I think from my perspective, we can unknowingly worship money, we can worship sex, we can worship family. You follow me? Over the God of creation, if you will.
Yeah.
And I guess that's, and I don't think we always knowingly change our focus. I like the binocular thing you did. You stuck your hands up next to your face, and it is a turning, it's a shifting. And I think when we turn towards other things and desire knowingly or unknowingly to worship them, we're missing out on that opportunity to really have fundamental worship over the God of creation. I guess it kind of comes back to they have worshiped the created versus the creator.
Yeah. Which that shows how great our creator is, as that there are so many aspects to his creation that are truly worshipful. Like we could worship that. It's so like nature.
It's big enough. It's amazing enough.
Right, that you could be content in that worship. I mean, you know what I mean?
It could fill,
or family.
Yes.
Or what, all the things you listed, like all those things are created, and yet they fill a big enough void in our life that they can replace our need for worship. Like, but the beautiful thing about that is it was created. All these things were created by a creator. So we could go right to the top.
Exactly.
In our worship. And,
yes.
Yeah. But I love what you're saying. Go ahead.
And I think that's where I think, the question when I started for you is, how do you in that process bring it back to focusing at the top? Because I think that's what, and I think my desire, in worship is to make my perspective of God bigger. Not that I make God bigger by worshiping him, but I recognize that he is active, he is sufficient, he is moving on my behalf in such a way that says, even in that difficult situation, he's still moving and acting. And, even in the process of death, even in the process of birth, he's moving just as much, and he's just as big when I've lost a relationship as he is when I'm
at my wedding day.
Yes. And I think when I can do that, I think that's when I've learned to do what you're describing in that process of living a life of worship.
Yeah, and I think earlier what I was trying to say is that I don't want to indicate that you can just flip a switch and you can now be like this. I think it does take work. It takes attention to move towards that, to where more and more interactions in your life become worship. I think it takes work. It takes intention. It takes time.
Sure.
So I definitely didn't want to indicate you could just flip on a switch, because I just don't think that's true. But there's certainly things you can do, and I always like the 12 steps as a potential solution to any problem. It's a framework, if you will, that I like to go, hey, you asked a problem question. I wonder if you could apply this solution, this tool to this. Would it work? And I think in this case, like, first of all, denial is the very first lesson we talk about in the 12 steps. Are you denying the fact that you're worshiping something over and above the God of the universe? Well, until you get over that denial, I mean, your steps are complete, right? Like, there are no further steps until that step is complete. So I think step one is to recognize, I should consider whether something is taking my intentioned focus off of my Creator and becoming the object, the thing, the person, the whatever that I worship. Because I think about that thing. Yes. I focus my attention on that thing more than I do him. Yeah. So step one, are you in denial? Because you can't move forward until you recognize, yes, I have an issue here. Yes. So I think the second thing that we talk about in the 12 steps is, do you know what the second lesson is?
You go ahead.
Powerless, yes. Powerless, yeah. It's this idea that, well, I got here over the course of my lifetime, and I can't just flip a switch.
Sure.
I can't just...
It's a process.
Tap into my willpower and flip a switch and be different. So I'm recognizing that. Like, that's another step until you recognize you can't just flip a switch and become a different person like that. Right. You are powerless to make that change on your own in this instant without any assistance. Sure. Like, I think that's the next part, is to say, I recognize I'm worshiping the wrong things.
It's a choice. And I'm recognizing I've made choices.
Right, but also at this point, it's ingrained. Sure. These choices have defined who I am and how I do life. Right. And recognizing that. And then the next step is hope. Yes. The next lesson is hope. And once you get past, my hope lies in me. Nope, I'm powerless. Put that on the table, right? What's next? It's hope. It's why do we have hope? Well, because we have a higher power. Sure. It's this idea that I can be pulled out of my current abilities into this much bigger sphere of ability because of a higher power who essentially superpowers me, right? Yes. It's this hope that says, oh, but I can change, not on my own, not because of my own abilities, but because I have something bigger, a source to tap into. Sure. And that's when worship starts. Sure. Right? Yeah. I'm now not looking at my thing. I'm not looking at my problem. I'm now looking at my source of hope. Yes. And that's when worship starts. I mean, so that's kind of the irony of this thing, right? Like, you're already beginning, Yeah. And I do think that's the idea, is then taking, continuing forward with that. I'm not gonna go through the whole 12
I got you.
But it's just a good framework for solving problems, And
I think that's part of that. When we choose to worship and God becomes bigger, our sense of hope increases with that. Yes. That there is a purpose. Go ahead. I see it.
Well, I was gonna stop, but I want to kind of just summarize the rest of the steps, which is now you do the work, but you don't do it in your own. Sure. On your own. You do it with this assumption that I have a higher power in a community, because then we talk about getting community into your recovery, well, in this case, into whatever the problem is. Sure. So you get accountability, like I was talking about. You get other people in your life who are doing this. Sure. And say, I'm going to pay attention to this. I'm going to be around these people. I'm going to be in environments where they practice this and I can learn how to practice this, right? Sure. You do the work, quote unquote, but now you're empowered by higher power. And as you shift towards the other side where you're like, I'm becoming better at this, you start to give back. Sure. You start to model worship. You start to encourage others. Well, you're staring at this thing. What about staring up above it at the Creator, right? Like, you start giving back from what you've been given. And when you help others, the profundity.
There you go. Nice job. Cool.
Mark's eyebrows raised. Yeah, I'm not sure that's a real word.
Well, like you say,
the profundity of helping someone through something that you have worked through cannot be undermined. Like, it cannot. It's amazing.
Yes,
this is what I'm saying.
Yes,
when I'm able to say, "Hey, this is what worked for me," and you're going, "Wow, that makes sense." Sure, because it's coming from someone who's not like in a crystal palace of or academia of like teaching you. It's like, this is real world stuff that I did that helped, Shoo. So yeah, that whole process, that 12-step kind of process, really does work to get you from, I think, and the reason why I wanted to wrap that up is because I think this is a cool framework that you can take, package up, and apply to other problems, right?
Sure.
Other issues in life, whatever the hang up is.
Yeah.
I don't worship the right things. Well, that's a hang up. You know, you can tackle it with this particular framework, but you can also just keep this framework in mind for the next time you're like, I don't do X and I want to do it more.
Yeah.
Or I do too much of Y and I want to stop, you know?
Yeah. No, and it's interesting as as you wrap it up, even the benefit of the collective aspect of worship, but yet I don't think we can, I never want that to be greater than my own individual aspect of choosing, choosing to worship even in isolation, going into the creation by myself with God, in that process of choosing, because I do think, we can tend to minimize one or the other. Yeah. And I think both are beneficial.
And I would even say that corporate worship. So corporate worship is this idea of us all worshiping together in a room or whatever, right? Like looking, like all standing together, looking at the direction of God. Right?
Sure.
So that's what we call corporate worship. It can be on a beach, it can be in a church, right? Like, but it's this idea of worship, corporate worship. I think that's enhanced by personal worship. I think when you, I guess that's what I was saying, like throughout the week, when you're learning how to worship and you bring that into a corporate worship experience, that experience is that much more meaningful.
Sure.
But I also don't think it's required. I think corporate worship is an example of accountability. Like I said, watching other people do it and seeing like they are meaning what they're singing,
right?
Or they're meaning. Like I'm standing next to someone who's got their arms raised, their head up, and their eyes closed, and they're singing, and it's like there's something about this person, they're meaning what they're why, and I go, oh yeah, the lyrics, oh yeah, it's talking about, oh yeah, and now my arms are, you know what I mean, like, so I think corporate worship is amazing because it is an opportunity. It can be its own catalyst towards personal worship.
Sure.
To point me in the right direction, which is very much a huge purpose as a worship leader, is to take someone whose focus is anywhere else. Their kids were naughty on the way to church or whatever, and say, hey, remember why we're here? Let's do this thing. Like let's refocus our attention. And I think that's an awesome opportunity as a worship leader to say, let's all remember what we're doing here. Let's do this because this is important and this is good and this is sometimes very emotionally beneficial or whatever. Like all these benefits that you can get. But I'm glad we talked about the concerns of, emotions are not it.
Yeah.
That is a choice. It is meant to be some of my favorite worship songs are the ones that say, I choose to lift my hands, or I'm going to sing louder than my unbelief. We did that Sunday, or I raise a hallelujah. It's this idea that I'm choosing to worship over my unbelief, louder, right? Because that's still there.
Sure.
But that's not, worship is not a feeling. It's kind of like love in relationships where we talk about love is not a feeling, love is an action, right?
Sure. It's a verb.
Yeah, and I think worship could probably be summarized that way as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And I like the analogy you used with the corporate worship of, hey, let's remember why we're here, and I still can recognize that even in the individual dynamic of how important to be able to recognize why we're here, because our lives have purpose. And I think we have a greater profoundness in our purpose when we're able to recognize that in such a way that says, okay, God, what do you have for me? And help me to worship you in my work, in my fatherhood, in my serving other people, you know, because that is what I'm here for. And even in that, God can bring other people for us in that same way to serve when we're at that deep point of maybe even not necessarily wanting to choose to worship. I think, you know, we can get to those points, and I think that's where it comes to for me is how do I recognize that point and I can still choose to worship even when it seems as if all hope may be lost for a moment. You follow me? And I want to stay on the upper end of it, but I think that's the beauty of the choice we have, and we can recognize that the Creator cares even if we're not sure that He does in the moment.
Right. That's where the choice comes.
That's where the choice
override
comes
the
from.
unbelief.
Yes.
Yeah. That's where the faith is the substance of things hoped for. It's this idea. I will believe despite
my circumstance.
A circumstantial substance.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
It's a faith substance. That is what I am hoping.
And I think in some ways that is that analogy that suddenly my focus has shifted. And this thing is greater than God. And how do we shift that in such a way that says God is greater than my thing? And I'm that circumstantial experience. And that's where I'm able to find hope. That's where I'm able to recognize the purpose in it. Yeah.
And back to what I was saying about being a lifetime thing, playing high school basketball, my coach, I went to a Christian school. Before every game, we would quote 1 Corinthians 10:31. Whether you eat or drink, whatsoever you do all for the glory of God. Team!
Yeah, cool.
Right?
Yeah, break.
Break, exactly. But we would quote that. And it's become a profound part of my life to recognize that, or play basketball, or do the dishes, or go, I used to be a house painter, go paint this house in the blazing heat.
Yeah.
Do it for the glory of God. And to me, that's worship, you know? So I was being molded and taught that idea of daily worship, even then, you know, through our chant before going out on the court. And I also think of other verses memorized as a child. Romans 8:28. All things work together for good for those who are called according to His purpose. This goes back to the beginning of our conversation.
Did you do that one more? Can you do that one more time?
Romans 8. Did I say it wrong?
No, I just curious.
Romans 8:28. All things work together for good for those who are called according to His purpose.
Now, see, I like the other version better that says God works all things together for good.
Yes.
Versus all things nebulously working together for our good. That there is a God.
Yeah.
In some versions before that, all things, because I think we can tend to. That's just a
it's good. Yeah.
It's the fact
the verses behind and in front of it also provide that context.
Yeah.
So it is very clear that that's what it is if you read. But that's good. I think.
Sorry, I didn't mean to.
No, it's good. But that goes back to the beginning of our conversation about like, well, the kid's sick. I gotta go pick him up.
Yeah.
All things.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, God. Let's do this. This is for your glory.
Yeah.
It's for some purpose, you know.
Yeah.
Or the other one that we memorized in high school. Let your light so shine before men that they might see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven.
Sure.
And it's like this idea that I can be a catalyst for worship through my work. And that's worship. That's intentional direction of my focus, right? Like, I'm going to do good work. And that means show up on time at my job. That means don't skip steps. That means treat others with respect. And hopefully that becomes a catalyst for someone else seeing that good work and going, what is this? You know?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
All part of your act, not in a negative sense, but an act of worship, a process of worship for that individual. Yeah.
And I think when worship becomes so profound to where all these verses start to point you towards what worship looks like, now you have an opportunity to have what you were asking about in the beginning, right? It's this idea that worship is more than just someone who's happy all the time, or
yes,
it's
more than just a circumstantial moment.
Yeah.
It's an infusing. It becomes part of who I am.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for sharing, Justin.
I told you I could go on and on about this subject.
Well, like you say, I value what you do, you and Megan, in that process of CR and the way you folks routinely lead worship, and it just and recognizing how songs have that ability to shift realign our focus, or and I think that's an important part of the collective process, and yet I think it has significance in the individual dynamics as well.
Yeah, it's a bummer we didn't get to talk about songs more, because
I hear you.
I mean, that's how you kind of started it with the songs, and I think there's so much to say about songs as a subset of worship.
Sure.
But I do think this is a more important conversation to start with, right?
Yeah, that can come out of our praise
there you go.
podcast.
Praise episode.
Yes. We can do a praise episode.
All right.
Yeah.
That's good.
Well,
but remember, you can worship by turning a wrench.
Yes.
You can worship by any given thing throughout the day.
Yeah.
That's how I see it anyway.
And that's how I see it. Thanks for sharing.
Hey, thank you for listening to our podcast. If you like How I See It, please do all the things that podcasts tell you to do. Subscribe, rate, review, follow us, and or talk nicely about us on social media. If you want to reach out, the email is us@howiseeit.click. Yep, I said .click, as in .click. Please tell your friends about this show, and we'll see you on the next one.